The sun rose bright and clear on Coronation Day. All across London, people were getting ready for the big event. Flags hung from buildings. Streets were clean and shiny. Workers set up barriers along the roads where the royal cars would drive. This was a day that would go down in history. Inside Kensington Palace, the home of Prince William and Kate, it was a busy morning. Servants rushed from room to room. Royal helpers checked their watches every few minutes. Today was the day when King Charles, William's father, would finally get his crown. In their bedrooms, 3 small children were being dressed in their finest clothes. 9-year-old Prince George stood still as a helper fixed his smart navy suit. He tried not to fidget as they pinned a small medal to his chest. George knew that one day, he too would be king. He wanted to make his parents proud today. In the room next door, 7-year-old Princess Charlotte twirled in her new white dress. She loved how the skirt moved when she spun around. Charlotte was a natural at royal events. She knew when to smile, when to wave, and when to stand still. Her long brown hair was brushed until it shone like silk. The most noise came from 4-year-old Prince Louis's room. The little boy jumped on his bed, full of energy and excitement. "Is there a party? Will there be cake?" Louis asked as a helper tried to get him into his blue suit. Kate walked into the room, already dressed in her beautiful outfit. "Louis, please stand still," she said with a smile. "Today is very important for Grandpa Charles." Louis stopped jumping but couldn't stop grinning. "Will I have to be quiet all day?" he asked. "Just try your best," Kate said, fixing his little tie. "And no funny faces at the cameras this time." Louis giggled, remembering how much fun he'd had at the last royal event when he pulled silly faces on the palace balcony. Prince William joined his family in the main room. He wore a fancy uniform with gold buttons and medals. He looked at his watch. "Time to go," he said. "The cars are waiting." The children lined up by the door. George stood tall and serious. Charlotte smoothed her dress one last time. Louis bounced on his toes, unable to keep still. "Remember," William said, crouching down to their level, "lots of people will be watching today. They've been waiting for hours to see Grandpa become king." "And to see us," Louis added, making everyone laugh. Outside, 3 shiny black cars waited. Rain had been expected, but the clouds had cleared. It was as if even the weather knew this was a special day. The royal family split up. William and George, the future kings, took the first car. Kate, Charlotte, and Louis took the second. Royal helpers followed in the third. As their car moved through the London streets, the children looked out of the windows. Thousands of people lined the roads, waving flags and cheering. Some had camped overnight just to get a good spot. "Look at all the people," Louis said, pressing his face against the window. "They're here to see Grandpa become king," Charlotte explained to her little brother. "And us too," Louis insisted again, making Kate smile. The cars drove slowly through the crowded streets. Police officers on motorcycles led the way. The closer they got to Westminster Abbey, the bigger the crowds became. Inside the car, Kate helped the children prepare. She straightened George's tie and fixed Charlotte's hair. Louis kept asking questions about the crown and the ceremony. "Will the crown be heavy? Can I touch it? Does Grandpa get to keep it at home?" Finally, they reached Westminster Abbey. This old church had seen many kings and queens crowned over hundreds of years. Now it was Charles's turn. The car stopped at the entrance. Outside, the crowd roared with excitement. The moment had come. It was time for the royal children to step out and face the world on this historic day. The big black car door opened. Outside, hundreds of cameras flashed like lightning. The noise of the crowd was so loud it made little Louis cover his ears for a moment. Kate stepped out first, her dress shining in the morning sun. She turned and held out her hand to help the children. Charlotte came out next. She remembered her training and gave a small, perfect wave to the people. The crowd cheered even louder when they saw her. She stood straight and tall, just like she had practiced at home. George followed, looking serious and a bit nervous. He was old enough to understand how important today was. He stood close to his father, watching how William nodded to the important people who greeted them. Louis was the last to step out. His eyes grew wide at the sight of so many people. For a second, he froze, holding tight to his mother's hand. Then he saw someone in the crowd with a funny hat shaped like the British flag. A big smile spread across his face. "Look, Mummy," he said, pointing and jumping up and down. "That hat is silly." Kate gently lowered his pointing hand, but she couldn't help smiling. The crowd laughed and took even more pictures. Just like that, little Louis had stolen the show. The family walked slowly toward the big doors of Westminster Abbey. The building was over 700 years old. Kings and queens had been crowned there for centuries. Its tall stone walls and giant stained glass windows made it look magical. "It's like a castle from my books," Charlotte whispered to her brothers. Inside, the abbey was filled with flowers and candles. The sweet smell of flowers mixed with the old stone smell of the building. Important people from all over the world sat in rows of seats. They all turned to look as William, Kate, and the children walked down the long aisle. Louis couldn't help himself. He waved at everyone they passed. Some people waved back, even though they weren't supposed to. George tried to copy his father's serious walk. Charlotte kept perfect time with the slow music that played. They reached their seats at the front of the abbey. From here, they could see the special throne where Grandpa Charles would sit to get his crown. Louis bounced on his seat, trying to see everything at once. When does it start? Where's Grandpa? Why is everyone so quiet? Louis whispered loudly. "Shh," Charlotte told her little brother. "We have to be good now." The music grew louder. Everyone stood up as King Charles entered from a side door. He wore a long, heavy robe of red and gold. He walked slowly, looking straight ahead. For a moment, as he passed their row, he gave his grandchildren a quick wink that only they could see. Louis giggled and waved. Charlotte curtsied perfectly, even though she was standing between two chairs. George gave a small bow, just as he had been taught. The ceremony began with songs from the choir. Their voices filled the huge space, floating up to the high ceiling. Louis watched the singers with his mouth open in wonder. He had never heard such beautiful music before. Next came long readings and prayers. This was the boring part. Louis started to fidget in his seat. Kate reached into her small bag and pulled out a tiny toy soldier. She slipped it into Louis's hand to keep him busy. It was their secret trick for long events. Charlotte sat perfectly still, watching everything with wide eyes. She loved the sparkly jewels on the crown that waited on a pillow nearby. One day, she would wear beautiful jewels too. George listened carefully to the words being spoken. His father had explained that he should pay attention because these same words would be used at his own coronation someday, many years in the future. Outside, the crowds had grown even bigger. People watched on giant screens set up in parks around London. Children sat on their parents' shoulders to get a better view. Everyone waited for the big moment when the crown would be placed on the new king's head. Back inside Westminster Abbey, the most important part of the ceremony was about to begin. The most important moment of the day was getting closer. King Charles sat on the special throne at the center of Westminster Abbey. Everyone in the huge church was quiet. Even little Louis stopped wiggling in his seat. The Archbishop, an old man with white hair and fancy robes, stepped forward. In his hands, he held a small glass bottle of special oil. This oil would be used to bless the new king. It was part of a tradition that went back hundreds of years. "What's he doing?" Louis whispered to Charlotte. "He's going to put some oil on Grandpa's head," Charlotte whispered back. "It's to show God has picked him to be king." Louis looked confused. "But won't it make his hair all messy?" Kate put her finger to her lips, but her eyes smiled. William coughed to hide his laugh. The Archbishop said some special words and put a drop of oil on King Charles's forehead. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. A man in a red uniform stepped forward carrying a purple cushion. On top sat the crown, heavy, golden, and covered with jewels that sparkled in the light. George sat up straighter in his seat. He knew that one day, many years from now, that same crown would be placed on his head. The thought made his heart beat faster. The archbishop picked up the crown very carefully with both hands. It looked heavy. Slowly, he raised it above King Charles's head. The whole abbey was so quiet you could hear the little coughs and shuffles of people moving in their seats. Then the crown was placed on the king's head. At that exact moment, trumpets started playing. The music was so loud and sudden that Louis jumped in his seat. "The crown, the crown," he said, pointing and bouncing up and down. "Grandpa has the crown now." People around them smiled at Louis's excitement. Even some of the serious-looking men in uniforms couldn't help but grin at the little prince. After the crown was placed on his head, King Charles stood up. He looked taller somehow, more kingly. The archbishop and other important people bowed to him. Then, one by one, the royal family had to go up and show respect to the new king. Prince William went first. He walked up to his father, bowed his head, and said words of loyalty. Then he did something that wasn't planned. He leaned forward and kissed his father's cheek. It was a son's love for his father, shown in front of the whole world. Next, it was George's turn. He had practiced this moment many times at home. Kate had played the part of the king, and they had used a paper crown. Now it was real. George walked slowly to where his grandfather sat. His legs felt wobbly, but he didn't show it. George made a perfect bow, just as he had practiced. King Charles looked at his grandson with pride in his eyes. He knew that one day George would wear the same crown. "Well done," the king whispered as George turned to walk back to his seat. Charlotte watched her brother carefully. She would be next. She smoothed her dress and took a deep breath. When her name was called, she walked gracefully to the throne. Her curtsy was perfect, one foot behind the other, her head bowed just right. The crowd made soft sounds of delight at how grown-up she looked. Louis was the last one. Everyone wondered what the little prince would do. Would he remember how to bow? Would he say something funny? Louis walked to his grandfather, his small face serious for once. He stood in front of the throne, looked up at the big crown, and then at his grandfather's face. Then, instead of bowing, Louis reached out his arms for a hug. A soft "aw" sound filled the abbey. King Charles smiled and leaned down to give his youngest grandson a quick hug. It wasn't part of the ancient ceremony, but it was perhaps the most real moment of the day. As Louis ran back to his parents, the choir began to sing again. The sound filled the huge space and rose up to the high ceiling. The coronation ceremony continued, but the children's sweet moments had already become the part that many people would remember most. After the crowning, there was more of the ceremony to sit through. The children tried their best to stay still. George sat up straight, watching everything with serious eyes. Charlotte folded her hands neatly in her lap, but little Louis was finding it harder and harder to sit quietly. "How much longer?" Louis whispered to his mother. He started swinging his legs back and forth under his chair. "Not too long now," Kate whispered back. She reached into her small bag again and pulled out a tiny coloring book and a short pencil. This was her second secret trick for keeping Louis busy. Louis began to color quietly, his tongue sticking out of the corner of his mouth as he concentrated. The people sitting behind the royal family smiled at the sight. It was a reminder that even royal children are still just children. The ceremony went on with more prayers and songs. Then it was time for King Charles to hold the royal items, a special ball called the orb, and a fancy stick called the scepter. These showed his power as king. Charlotte watched with wide eyes. The orb was golden with a cross on top. It sparkled with diamonds and other gems. The scepter was long and had the biggest diamond in the world at the top. "It looks like a magic wand," Charlotte whispered to George. George nodded. "Those will be mine someday," he whispered back. The thought made him feel both proud and a little scared. Louis looked up from his coloring. "Can I hold the magic stick?" he asked, a bit too loudly. Several people nearby heard and tried not to laugh. Kate gently shushed him. Outside the abbey, the crowds were watching on big screens. When they saw Louis talking and Kate trying to keep him quiet, they laughed and cheered. The little prince was becoming the star of the show. Inside, the ceremony continued. King Charles had to sign some important papers. The choir sang more songs. Important people made speeches. It was the kind of thing that grown-ups find interesting but children find boring. Louis finished his coloring and started to get restless again. He yawned, a big wide yawn that he didn't even try to cover. Cameras caught the moment, and soon people all around the world would be smiling at pictures of the little prince yawning at his grandfather's coronation. Charlotte noticed and gave her little brother a gentle poke. "Louis," she whispered, "you need to be good. Everyone is watching." Louis tried to sit up straighter like George, but it was hard. The ceremony had been going on for nearly 2 hours now. That's a long time for a 4-year-old boy to sit still. Finally, there was a change in the music. The choir began to sing a happy song. People started to stand up. The ceremony was coming to an end. "Is it over?" Louis asked hopefully. "Almost," William told him with a smile. "You've been very good." King Charles stood up from his throne. With the crown on his head and holding the orb and scepter, he began to walk slowly down the aisle. Everyone bowed as he passed by. The royal family would follow him. William and Kate gathered the children. "Remember to walk slowly," Kate reminded them, "and wave to the people when we get outside." As they prepared to follow the king, something unexpected happened. The heavy crown slipped a little on King Charles's head. Without thinking, he reached up to straighten it. Louis saw this and giggled. "Grandpa's crown is falling off," he said in a voice that carried farther than Kate would have liked. People who heard couldn't help but smile. Even some of the serious guards at the side of the church had to work hard not to laugh. As they began to walk out behind the king, photographers took hundreds of pictures. The children blinked in the bright camera flashes. George walked perfectly, just like his father. Charlotte kept in step with the music. Louis tried his best, but got distracted by the colorful uniforms of the guards. Outside, the crowds were waiting. The biggest part of the day was still to come, when the royal family would appear on the palace balcony for everyone to see. The children didn't know it yet, but their biggest moment in the spotlight was just ahead. When the royal family stepped outside Westminster Abbey, the noise hit them like a wave. Thousands of people cheered and clapped. The sound bounced off buildings and filled the air. Flags waved everywhere they looked. Louis jumped at the sudden noise. He grabbed Kate's hand tightly. For a moment, he looked worried by all the sound and movement. Then he saw how happy everyone was. His smile returned, bigger than ever. "Look at all the flags," Louis shouted, pointing with his free hand. The family walked down the steps of the abbey. Soldiers in red coats and tall black furry hats stood on both sides, keeping still as statues. Charlotte looked at them with interest. She wondered if they ever got tired of standing so straight. "Do those men ever smile?" she whispered to her mother. "Not while they're working," Kate whispered back. "It's their job to look serious." George walked with his head high, just like his father. He nodded to people as he passed, acting every bit like the future king he would one day become. Some people in the crowd called his name. "Prince George, over here." He gave them a small, polite wave. The family climbed into a golden carriage waiting for them. It was like something from a fairy tale, with big wheels and beautiful designs carved into the sides. 4 white horses stood ready to pull it through the streets of London. A real princess carriage. Charlotte gasped with delight as a helper lifted her inside. Louis scrambled in after her, nearly tripping on the steps in his excitement. Once inside, he bounced on the soft seats. "Horses. We get to ride with horses," he said, pointing at the beautiful white animals in front. The carriage was old and very special. It had carried kings and queens for over 100 years. The inside was lined with soft red velvet. The windows were large, so people could see the royal family as they passed by. As the carriage began to move, Louis pressed his face against the window. Outside, the crowds were 10 people deep in some places. Many had camped overnight to get a good spot to see the new king and his family. "Wave to the people," William reminded the children. George and Charlotte waved perfectly, moving their hands back and forth like they had been taught. Louis, on the other hand, waved with his whole arm, so excited that he nearly hit the roof of the carriage. The carriage rolled slowly through the streets of London. Police officers on horses rode in front and behind. Soldiers marched alongside. The sound of music and cheering followed them all the way. "Are all these people here to see us?" Louis asked. "They're here to see Grandpa in his new crown," George explained to his little brother. "But they're happy to see us too." Charlotte noticed something interesting. "Look," she said, pointing out the window. "Some people are crying." She was right. In the crowd, some people had tears running down their faces. They were happy tears. For many people, seeing a coronation was a once-in-a-lifetime event. The carriage passed famous London places: Big Ben, the Houses of Parliament, Trafalgar Square. In each place, more crowds waited and cheered. The children had never seen so many people in one day. Louis began to get tired from all the waving. His arm flopped down to his side. "My arm hurts," he complained. "You can rest for a minute," Kate told him. "But we'll be at the palace soon. Then we need to wave from the balcony." At the mention of the balcony, Louis perked up again. The balcony appearance was famous all over the world. The royal family would stand high up on the palace balcony, looking out over thousands of people below. "Will there be airplanes?" Louis asked hopefully. He loved the airplanes that sometimes flew over at special royal events. William nodded. "Yes, there will be a fly past. Red, white, and blue smoke trailing behind the planes." Louis clapped his hands with joy. Airplanes were his favorite thing, even better than royal carriages. As they got closer to Buckingham Palace, the crowds grew even bigger. People pushed against the barriers, trying to get a good view. Police officers worked hard to keep everyone safe. Finally, the golden gates of the palace came into view. The carriage passed through them and into the private courtyard beyond. The ride was over, but the most exciting part of the day was still to come. Inside Buckingham Palace, servants rushed about getting ready for the balcony appearance. The huge building was buzzing with activity. In a side room, William and Kate helped their children freshen up after the long carriage ride. "My legs feel funny from sitting so long," Louis said, jumping up and down to wake them up. Kate smoothed Charlotte's hair and fixed the small tiara that had slipped a little to one side. George stood still as William brushed some dust off his shoulders. "Remember," William told the children, "the balcony appearance is very important. Millions of people will be watching on TV." "Millions?" Charlotte's eyes went wide. "Yes," Kate said. "People all around the world want to see King Charles and his family on this special day." Louis wasn't listening. He had found a large mirror and was making funny faces at himself. Each face was sillier than the last. Kate saw what he was doing and tried not to laugh. "Louis," she said gently, "save those funny faces for later, please." Down the grand hallway, they could hear music playing. The palace band was performing for the guests who had been invited inside. Many important people waited in the grand rooms: presidents, prime ministers, and other royals from different countries. A palace worker came to tell them it was almost time. King Charles was ready. The balcony appearance would happen in 5 minutes. "Can I stand next to Grandpa?" Louis asked. "We'll see," Kate said. "There's a special order we need to stand in." They walked through the palace to reach the room behind the balcony. The floors were shiny and made of beautiful wood. Huge paintings hung on the walls. Some showed kings and queens from long ago. The children's footsteps echoed in the big rooms. King Charles waited for them, still wearing his crown and special robes. He looked tired but happy. Being king was hard work, especially on Coronation Day. "Here come my favorite grandchildren," he said with a smile. "We're your only grandchildren, Grandpa," Charlotte reminded him with a giggle. The king laughed. "That's why you're my favorites." Louis ran up to his grandfather and pointed at the crown. "Is it heavy?" he asked. "Very heavy," the king told him. "It weighs more than a big bag of apples." Louis thought about this. "Can I try it on?" he asked hopefully. The adults all laughed. "Not today," the king said. "Maybe when you're older." A palace worker opened the glass doors that led to the balcony. Outside, they could hear the roar of the crowd waiting in front of the palace. There must have been thousands of people packed into the space below. The sound was like the ocean during a storm. "It's time," William said. The family lined up in order. King Charles would go first, then Queen Camilla. William and Kate would follow with their children. Other members of the royal family would come after them. "Remember to smile and wave," Kate reminded the children one last time. "And no silly faces," Charlotte whispered to Louis. Louis nodded, but there was a twinkle in his eye that made Kate wonder what he might do. King Charles stepped out onto the balcony first. The crowd below went wild with cheers and clapping. The sound hit them like a physical force. It was so loud that Charlotte jumped a little. One by one, the royal family filed onto the balcony. When George appeared, people cheered for the future king. Charlotte came next, waving gracefully to the crowds. Then it was Louis's turn. He stepped out onto the balcony and saw the sea of people below. Thousands of faces looked up at him. Flags waved everywhere. The noise was bigger than anything he had ever heard. For a moment, he stood still, taking it all in. Then his face broke into the biggest smile imaginable. He began to wave with both hands, jumping up and down with excitement. The crowd loved it. They cheered even louder for the little prince who couldn't contain his joy. Camera flashes went off like stars, capturing the moment. In homes around the world, people watching on TV smiled at the sight of his pure happiness. The royal family now stood in a line across the balcony, facing the biggest crowd any of them had ever seen. The balcony of Buckingham Palace was not very big, but today it held the most important people in Britain. King Charles stood in the middle, his crown shining in the afternoon sun. Next to him stood Queen Camilla, William, Kate, and the children, along with other members of the royal family. Below them, the crowd filled the entire space in front of the palace. People stood shoulder to shoulder, waving flags and taking pictures. Many held up their phones to record this historic moment. Louis could not believe his eyes. He had been on the balcony before, but never with so many people watching. He waved until his arm felt tired, then switched to his other arm. "Look how many people came to see Grandpa's special day," he said loudly. People nearby on the balcony smiled at his words. Even the king turned and gave his grandson a wink. George stood tall beside his father. He waved in a calm, regular way, just as he had been taught. His face was serious most of the time, but sometimes he couldn't help smiling when he saw funny signs in the crowd or when Louis said something silly. Charlotte stood between her brothers. Her waves were perfect. Not too fast, not too slow. Every now and then, she would curtsy to the crowd, making them cheer even louder. Suddenly, Louis spotted something in the distance. His face lit up with excitement. "The planes. The planes are coming," he shouted, pointing to the sky. Everyone looked where he was pointing. In the distance, they could see small dots growing larger. The Royal Air Force planes were approaching for the flypast. The crowd below turned to look too. A hush fell over them as they waited. Even Louis went quiet with anticipation. The first planes flew overhead in perfect formation. They were painted red, white, and blue, the colors of the British flag. As they passed over the palace, they released smoke in those same colors. The smoke trails stretched across the blue sky like ribbons. "Wow!" Louis shouted, jumping up and down. He pointed and clapped his hands. His excitement was so pure and natural that everyone around him smiled. More planes followed. Big ones, small ones, old ones, and new ones. Each group flew in a different pattern. The noise was very loud, but Louis didn't cover his ears this time. He was too thrilled to care about the noise. The last plane to fly over was the biggest, a huge RAF transport plane flanked by fighter jets. As it passed overhead, Louis's mouth fell open in amazement. "That one's as big as our house," he said. Kate laughed and put her hand on his shoulder. The little prince's comments were being picked up by microphones nearby. Tomorrow, his words would be in newspapers all around the world. The fly past lasted about 6 minutes. When the last plane disappeared, the crowd cheered louder than ever. The royal family waved one final time before preparing to go back inside. But Louis wasn't ready to leave. He ran to the edge of the balcony for one last look at the people below. He gave them his biggest wave yet, using both arms like he was trying to fly himself. The crowd loved it. They cheered and laughed at the little prince's enthusiasm. Camera flashes went off by the thousands, capturing what would become the most famous image of the day. William walked over and put his hand on Louis's shoulder. "Time to go inside now," he said gently. Louis nodded, but before turning away, he blew a big kiss to the crowd with both hands. The people below roared with delight. Some even blew kisses back. Charlotte thought this was a wonderful idea and did the same. Even serious George gave the crowd a small salute before turning to follow his parents inside. As they walked back through the glass doors, Louis took one last look over his shoulder. The balcony would be empty now until the next big royal event. Inside the palace, the children could still hear the crowd cheering. The sound followed them down the grand hallway like a wave. "Did I do good, Mummy?" Louis asked Kate as they walked. Kate smiled and squeezed his hand. "You did wonderfully," she said. "I think you were everyone's favorite part of the day." Louis beamed with pride. He didn't fully understand that his natural happiness had brought joy to millions of people. He was just being himself, a little boy on a very big day. Back inside the palace, the royal family gathered in a large room with tall windows and golden furniture. King Charles had taken off his heavy crown and placed it carefully on a special cushion. His shoulders relaxed now that the weight was gone. "Can we have cake now?" Louis asked, looking around hopefully. In his mind, all big events should end with cake. The adults laughed. "Yes, there will be cake," William promised. "But first, we have a special lunch with important guests." The children were hungry after the long morning. They followed their parents to a huge dining room. The table was longer than a bus and covered with a white cloth. Golden plates and cups sat in front of each chair. Fresh flowers made the room smell sweet. Many important people waited there: presidents, prime ministers, kings, and queens from other countries. They all stood up when King Charles entered the room. George, Charlotte, and Louis had their own special table near their parents. Royal helpers served them child-friendly food: chicken, potatoes, and vegetables cut into fun shapes. "My carrots are shaped like crowns," Charlotte said with delight. Louis picked up a potato shaped like a star and held it high. "Look at mine," he said. George was more interested in the important people around the room. "That's the President of France," he whispered to his siblings, pointing with his eyes toward a man in a dark suit. Throughout the meal, many guests came to speak to the children. They told the young royals how well they had done during the ceremony. Some asked for photos with them. Louis, now full of food and feeling shy again, hid behind Kate during most of these conversations. After lunch came the part Louis had been waiting for: dessert. Servants brought in a magnificent cake decorated with crown designs made of sugar. It was taller than Louis himself. "That's the biggest cake I've ever seen." Louis gasped, his eyes wide. King Charles was given the honor of cutting the first slice. Cameras flashed as he pressed the knife into the cake. Then everyone got a piece. The cake was vanilla with strawberry filling, Louis's favorite. He ate his slice so quickly that he ended up with frosting on his nose. Charlotte giggled and pointed it out to him. Louis wiped it off with the back of his hand before any of the grown-ups could see. After the meal, there was time to rest before the evening events. The children were taken to a quiet room where they could relax. The day had been long and exciting, and they were all getting tired. Charlotte sat on a sofa and looked through a picture book about kings and queens. George talked quietly with William about the ceremony and all the things he had noticed. Louis lay on the carpet, playing with toy soldiers that a palace worker had brought for him. Kate watched her children with pride. They had handled the big day so well, especially considering how young they were. Louis had made people laugh. Charlotte had shown perfect princess manners, and George had been every bit the future king. A palace worker brought in a tray with hot chocolate for the children. As they sipped the warm drinks, William told them about the evening events. "There will be a light show at the palace tonight," he explained. "The building will be lit up with colorful lights. There will be music too. Can we watch from our window?" Charlotte asked. "Of course," Kate said. "You'll have the best view in London." Louis had another question. "Will there be fireworks?" William nodded. "Yes," at the very end. Louis clapped his hands with joy. He loved fireworks almost as much as he loved airplanes. As the children finished their hot chocolate, they could hear music starting outside. Bands were playing in the streets of London. The celebration was continuing all across the city. This day would be remembered for many years to come. "I wish every day could be Coronation Day," Louis said with a yawn. Despite his words, his eyes were getting heavy. The excitement was catching up with him. Kate smiled at her youngest son. "There's only one Coronation Day in a king's life," she explained. "That's what makes it so special." The children didn't know it yet, but their natural, unscripted moments during the day had already become the most talked about parts of the coronation. People everywhere were sharing pictures and videos of the young royals, especially little Louis with his big waves and bigger personality. Evening came to London. The sky turned pink and orange as the sun began to set. After their rest, the royal children were changed into fresh clothes for the evening celebrations. George wore a dark blue suit similar to his father's. Charlotte had a new dress in soft purple. Louis wore a smart outfit with a little bow tie that he kept trying to pull off. "The bow tie is itchy," he complained as Kate fixed it back in place. "Just for a little while longer," she told him with a smile. "You look very handsome." The children were taken to a special room at the front of the palace. This room had big windows that looked out over London. From here, they would watch the light show and fireworks without having to go outside in the cool evening air. Servants had prepared the room for them. There were comfortable chairs pulled up to the windows. A table held snacks, tiny sandwiches, fruit, and small cakes. Louis headed straight for the cakes, but William shook his head. "Dinner first, then treats," he said. Outside, the sky grew darker. Lights began to come on across London. The famous buildings, Big Ben, Tower Bridge, the London Eye, were all lit up in red, white, and blue. From the palace windows, the city looked magical. "It's like a fairy tale," Charlotte said, her face pressed against the glass. George pointed to the crowd still filling the streets. "Look how many people are still out there," he said. Even after the long day, thousands of people remained to enjoy the evening celebrations. A servant came in with dinner for the children. Simple food after the fancy lunch. They ate while looking out at the growing excitement in the city. As they finished eating, music began to play outside. It was loud enough to hear through the closed windows. Louis slid off his chair and started to dance, making his parents laugh. Even George and Charlotte joined in, moving to the happy music. "Now can I have cake?" Louis asked when the song ended. Kate nodded, and the children each chose a small cake from the table. As they ate, the main event began. Outside, colorful lights started to dance across the front of Buckingham Palace. The whole building was transformed. Pictures made of light moved across the walls. lions, unicorns, crowns, and flags. The children watched with open mouths, cake forgotten in their hands. "Look, there's Grandpa," Charlotte pointed as a giant picture of King Charles appeared on the palace wall. The image was made entirely of light. It smiled and then changed into the royal crown. The light show told the story of Britain's kings and queens through pictures. The children recognized some from their history lessons. George paid close attention, knowing he was seeing the story of his own family and future. After the light show came the moment Louis had been waiting for, the fireworks. The first rocket shot into the air and exploded with a loud boom, filling the sky with red sparks. Louis jumped up and down with excitement. "More, more," he shouted as if the people setting off the fireworks could hear him. More fireworks followed, gold ones that rained down like falling stars, purple ones that spread out like flowers, blue ones that crackled and popped. The sky was filled with color and light. Charlotte covered her ears at the loudest bangs, but couldn't take her eyes off the beautiful display. George watched with a smile, his arm around his little brother's shoulders. As the fireworks reached their grand finale, filling the night with light and noise, the children's faces glowed with wonder. This was a day they would never forget. When the last firework faded from the sky, Louis yawned again. It had been the longest, most exciting day of his young life. Kate noticed and checked her watch. "Time for bed, I think," she said gently. For once, Louis didn't argue. He was tired from all the excitement. Charlotte's eyes were getting heavy too. Even George looked ready for sleep. As William and Kate led their children away to get ready for bed, they could still hear the crowd celebrating outside. The Coronation Day was ending, but the memory of it would last forever. That night, as Kate tucked Louis into bed, he asked one last question. "Did we do good today, Mummy?" Kate smoothed his hair and smiled. "You did more than good. You were perfect, all three of you. You made a very special day even more special." Louis smiled sleepily. "It was the best day ever," he whispered as his eyes closed. In homes across Britain and around the world, people were saying the same thing as they looked at pictures and videos of the royal children. On this historic day, it was the natural joy and wonder of three small children that had captured hearts everywhere.